It was 1977. I had taken time off work to have a baby and stay home with her. But I still needed an income, so my mother had hired my younger sister and me to do the dirty, back-breaking work in her shop while she took care of her first infant granddaughter. My sister and I were working at our mom's antique store one summer day. Mom had just gotten a truckload of European oak furniture that needed to be cleaned and polished, have the handles screwed on and so forth. A nice-looking young man came into the store and started talking to my sister, who was 17 at the time. He introduced himself as Ted Smith, and we laughed and said we must be related as Mom's maiden name was Smith also. He chatted both of us up, but focused on Sis for the most part. He purchased an armoire, but said he'd have to go get his truck, since at the moment he was driving his VW Bug, an old VW Bug. He then asked my sister and me if we wanted to go out to dinner that night with him. We were sweaty and dirty from work. I had a baby to care for, and Sis already had a boyfriend, so we said, "Thanks, but no thanks, Ted." He asked me to ride with him to get his truck so he could drop his Bug off at the auto shop for repairs, but by that point I had to get home to my infant. Right away, because I was still nursing her, and I thought my breasts were going to begin leaking at any minute. However, he wouldn't give up trying to get one or both of us away from the shop. He said he could come back about 10 o'clock that evening for his armoire, and asked whether one or both of us be there. We replied, "No, we close the shop at 6 and we both have places to be tonight." He was persistent. "How about tomorrow night?" "No, we close at 6 o'clock except on Saturdays, when we close at 4 o'clock. He asked whether one of us could meet him early in the morning, like at 5:30 a.m., but neither of us wanted to. He was getting to be a bit creepy, and Sis and I were eye-rolling at each other. Eventually, he said he was sorry, but he couldn't buy the armoire if we couldn't be flexible. We hated to give up the sale, but after he had been there for 2 hours, we thought he was just looking and taking up our time. We still had a lot of work to do on the furniture that had just arrived in the shop. Finally, we just wanted to finish our work and go home. At 6 p.m., as we were leaving, his VW Bug was parked outside, and he asked us whether we want to go for coffee. He especially wanted my sister to go. We said, "Thanks, Ted, but no thanks. Like we said earlier, we have plans." But he continued to be insistent. Finally, I said, "Sis, let's go. I'll take you home." Even though she had her car there, for some reason I didn't want to leave her to drive home alone with this guy around. So he drove off in his Bug, and we really didn't think of it again. Until the next year, when this picture appeared in the paper. Ted Bundy. It still sends chills up my spine, writing this, and Sis and I talk about it occasionally. We were 2 lucky young women that day. If either of us had agreed to go, we would have been raped and murdered like the at least 30 other women Bundy kidnapped. Yes, I have been scared of being home alone. Back in August 2013, I was living in a single-room hostel in Mysore, India. So I and my friends one day decide to watch the movie Conjuring in the movie theater. Now, the movie didn't scare me as much as the after effects of the movie. All my friends were shit scared while on our way back to our rooms and were making plans of sleeping in each other's rooms for the night. I, as usual, showed my calm demeanor and avoided these plans. Instead, decided to sleep in my room all alone. Now it so happened that there was suicide on my floor just 5 months before I moved to my room same year, or so the rumor goes. Dead of the night, I'm thirsty. To fill the water, we had to walk to this desolate corner on our floor. As I reach there, I notice that the lights are flickering, and coincidentally, it starts to happen around the same time as I started walking towards the water cooler. This was the first time I actually started believing in supernatural presence. With immense courage, I do walk to the filter and start filling water with an eye out to check for any signs of abnormalities. I couldn't even fill half the bottle, then someone from the neighboring room switched on his TV, and the sudden noise scared the hell out of me. Needless to say, I ran back to my room and tried to make the most of just half the bottle of water. I was watching TV, and soon enough I fell asleep. Middle of the night, I hear two people talking in my room. I shout and rush to grab my rosary, prayer beads used by Roman Catholics, scared. It was then I realized that those two people were inside the TV. I felt asleep watching the movie and didn't switch it off. This happened around 2:30 a.m. Around same time, I heard some noise coming from the corridor of someone walking in anklets. Now in India, legend has it that female ghosts in white attire carrying a candle usually entice male by making this sweet sound with their anklets. And my first reaction was, there is this witch outside my door. I started praying and switched on all the lights in the room. I started reading the Holy Bible and even took it in my hand. Should anything walk in from the door, I can shoo it away. I spent the night horribly scared. However, every night from then on for the next 2 weeks, I heard those anklets around same time. I couldn't sleep and was emotionally disturbed. Seeing this, my parents flew in to be with me. I slept with them and was comfortable for a few days. We had a separate wing for guests where our parents could join us on campus. They stayed in those rooms. I simply went and slept with them. After they left, I felt quite good. But the same night when I came back, I heard the anklets one more time, and I took it upon myself to go and check for the noise. With balls of steel, I go to the peephole to see the ghost, only to realize it was the watchman, hostel security guard, walking around to make sure nobody is making noise and everyone are asleep. As for the anklet noise, it was because of the bunch of keys on his waist that made those noise. Needless to say, everyone had a good laugh about it later. This was the one and only time I was ever scared to be home alone. But in the hindsight, it did make up for good memories. I once knew a guy who looked almost exactly like me. He had the same curly brown hair, only slightly darker. He had the same crooked nose, only a bit smaller. Even our eyes were similar, both almond-shaped, but his irises were a slightly lighter shade of brown. He didn't just look like me either. We acted similarly, talked similarly, walked similarly. The list goes on. We only had slight variations in almost every aspect of our being. It was scary at first, but soon that fear developed into anger. I absolutely hated that lousy, good-for-nothing faker. Thomas Blake was his name. I met him in my junior year of high school. He transferred toward the beginning of the school year, since apparently his father was with the army and thus had to move around often. And yes, my mother was in the army as well, and this was the 3rd high school I had attended thus far. It was his 4th. That was a recurring theme with the variations between Thomas and I. He always seemed one step further. Not ahead, just further. When he was first introduced to the class, everybody made a huge deal about how similar we looked. Even the teacher was confused for a moment, thinking I was pulling some kind of prank. However, when they noticed me sitting in my seat at the back of the class as usual, eyes shifted between the two of us in astonishment as whispers were exchanged. In a similar state of surprise, my gaze was firmly fixed on Thomas, meeting his. Unlike me, however, he didn't appear surprised at all. He just looked at me with a slight smile as he went to take the seat the teacher pointed out for him. Said teacher always had a bit of a sense of humor. So of course, since Thomas needed a study buddy to get him caught up on the class's lesson content, I was the man for the job. During lunch break, people swarmed us. "Are you two related?" one person asked. "Are you like long-lost twins or something?" another hypothesized. My school had a fair amount of silly people among its student body, so all sorts of theories were thrown around. Maybe we were clones who'd escaped from a secret laboratory and gotten separated. Maybe we were the twin product of a steamy military love affair between his father and my mother, who then decided to split the two of us before leaving each other. Maybe we were even the same person from 2 different timelines that had somehow intersected. The theories just kept getting more convoluted as the class had a field day with it. Now, I didn't hate Thomas from the very start. In fact, we were something akin to friends at first. Our various similarities made that easy for us, plus the fact that everyone else was already calling us the twins a few hours after we'd met. Since I was his study buddy, the two of us spent a fair amount of time together. and I soon introduced him to my little clique of friends. That was when he began to creep me out a little. My 4 friends and I were sitting at a lunch table eating as usual when he walked up. "Hey, mind if I join you?" He pointed to one of us before shifting his finger to another. "And you?" Yet again, he shifted his finger and repeated the question until he pointed to me. He paused for a moment, then went, "And me?" Everybody except for me laughed at the odd little greeting. I just looked up at him with a half-assed grin, like I was attempting to find it funny, but blatantly failing. What caught me off guard was that, apart from that last bit, this was exactly how I'd first approached a group of kids in one of my last schools. Word for word. Of course, we invited him to sit with us, and I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that the event had left me with. I was able to forget about it for a while, but it wasn't long before it returned. Sure enough, as the days went on, he continued acting like me. He said things I would have said and did things I would have done. Not that he did this all the time. The variations between us made it so that it was relatively infrequent. However, it happened often enough for me to take notice and begin to get freaked out by it. Surely it wasn't normal for someone this similar to me to suddenly appear in my life. The odds were astronomical. But no matter how I tried to rationalize the impossibility of the fact, it never made it any less true. Although Thomas hung out with my group a lot those first few weeks, he soon began to hang out with other people as well. Our school was relatively small, so it was something all of us naturally did. Most people were at least acquainted with each other, whether in a good or bad way. However, people usually stuck to their particular groups of friends, having only 1 or 2 closer associates from other groups. There were a minority of people who had no particular clique, and instead had friends in many different cliques, or just fit in well with everyone. Chameleons, we called them. I myself was somewhat of a chameleon, and had many friends from other groups, but I had a specific group that I liked to hang with the most, composed of my 4 closest friends. Thomas, however, was different. When he began to hang out with other people and get along quite nicely with them, my friends and I determined he would probably end up becoming a chameleon too, if only partly. But we were surprised to find that he became something more. Something our school had rarely ever seen, and something that I personally hadn't seen very often either. Universally popular. Now, being universally popular wasn't some kind of superpower or anything, but it was quite an achievement nonetheless. I don't know exactly how he did it, but Thomas was essentially a friend to everyone in the school. He had even befriended the loner and unpopular kids who had initially hated him out of spite. "He just has this charisma," some said. "He's a really nice guy. I don't see why anyone wouldn't like him," said others. To them, it seemed perfectly natural to like a guy like Thomas. But it didn't make sense to me, because I had long since picked up on our similarities. If we were so similar, why was he so popular while I wasn't? Jealousy began to boil within me. What did he have that I didn't? I just couldn't understand it. But as I observed him and spent time with him, I realized I had been so focused on the similarities between us, I had failed to notice the variations. They ended up making all the difference. Thomas was more confident. He was slightly more handsome, had higher grades, and had a bit of an accent since he had lived in England for a time. Whatever we had in common, his variation was almost always better. That was when jealousy gave way to hatred. Not of Thomas, however. Of myself. For a while, I hated myself for not being as good as Thomas. The feeling of insecurity ate away at me for over 2 months, causing my grades to drop and my health to go down as I spent most of my time isolated. Friends tried to comfort me to no avail. My family tried to get me to see a psychiatrist or a therapist, but I refused. I looked to the internet for help with what I had come to believe was probably some form of depression, but despite all the good and bad advice, none of it seemed to change anything. Imagine my surprise, then, when all that it took to solve my problem was a trip to the dollar store. I had gone there with my father to buy something or other. As my dad looked for it, I got bored and wandered off to the toy section, where I gazed absent-mindedly at the cheap crap that passed for toys here. If you've ever been to a dollar store, You know that the merchandise they sell isn't exactly top-notch, and the kids' items are no exception. Countless rip-offs of famous toys littered the section. Roboformers, Action Rangers, Barbara Girls, that kind of near-copyright infringement thing. As I looked at them, I began to realize the case wasn't so different from my own situation. The Roboformers were almost exactly like Transformers, but there were a few minor differences to keep some small-time Chinese company from getting sued. And that's exactly what Thomas was. He was just a cheap rip-off version of me. It wasn't evident at first. I mean, Thomas was better than me, wasn't he? When I reevaluated him with this in mind, however, I found him to be quite different. His confidence was obnoxious, bordering on outright overconfidence. His grades were only higher than mine because I and many others had helped him study. His English accent was only faint and most likely somewhat forced. No matter how I looked at it, he was just nothing but a faker. And so, my hatred shifted from me onto him. With the problem of my insecurity gone, I returned to school and gradually returned to normal. I felt much better knowing that I was the original, and he was just a bad imitation masquerading as something better. I could easily fake who I was and become like him as well, but I wasn't that pathetic. I would stay true to who I was. Still, the problem wasn't entirely gone. Thomas and I still talked fairly often, and the more I saw him around, the more annoyed I got. It got to the point where simply hearing him speak would immediately flip my mood, regardless of what it was before. I knew that I couldn't keep being friendly for long, so I gradually tried to drift away from him, even if it meant staying away from a few of my other friends as well. It didn't work. Even when I didn't approach him, he approached me. Whenever I would try to leave him, he would flash that small smile that looked sickeningly similar to mine and try to convince me to stay. I hated him. I hated him so much that words could not even describe it. Everything he did only served to fuel the fire within me. Whenever I got the chance, I began to daydream about calling him out on his fakery and beating him up as a suitable punishment. These daydreams soon evolved into hypothetical plans of increasing complexity as I mulled over ways to get him expelled from school and out of my life forever. Then my mom made an unprecedented announcement. We were leaving. Her work required her to be stationed in New York, so I couldn't stay in my school. At first, I rejoiced. Finally, Thomas Blake would be out of my life forever. A couple of months passed and the week of the move came, so I said my goodbyes to all of my friends and acquaintances, and unfortunately, Thomas before leaving my school. But I didn't feel as good as I thought I would. Initially, I believed that getting away from Thomas was what I needed, but he just stayed on my mind. I was confused. Why couldn't I stop hating him, even after I'd never have to see him again? He was irrelevant now, after all. I could just leave him behind and start a new life somewhere else, where I was the only me. But no. I soon realized that no matter where I was on this planet, I simply could not condone a cheap rip-off of myself still existing out there, acting like he was better than me. Even if I never had to see him again, I'd know he still existed, and that would eat away at me forever. There was only one way I could solve the problem. I had to stop him from existing. But could I really go through with killing him? Coming up with a plan wasn't too hard, since I knew where he lived as well as the layout of his house. As much as my hatred compelled me, however, fear of the potential consequences halted me. In the end, I didn't even need to take the initiative. About a week before the scheduled time for the move, I got a call from none other than my would-be doppelganger. "Hey, Travis, want to hang out?" Thomas asked nonchalantly. "I know you're leaving soon, so I was thinking we should go somewhere one last time. I asked James and Sarah, but neither of them are available, so I guess it's just us." I couldn't help but smile at the opportunity. Maybe if I could get him all alone and make sure nobody found his body for a while, it could work. I was moving away soon anyway. "All right. Where'd you want to go?" "How about we head to the mall?" Thomas suggested. "There's some stuff I need to pick up there anyway." "All right," I replied. "How's tomorrow?" And with that, the deal was sealed. That night, I went out to set things up for my grand plan. The following day, I met Thomas at the mall just like we arranged, my mom's switchblade stuffed into my pocket for later use. All I needed to do was lead him to some secluded part of town on our way back home. I knew the town's layout better than he did, so I could just tell him I knew a shortcut. I kept telling myself it'd be easy, but my heart raced the entire time we were at the mall. We acted all buddy-buddy as we usually did, despite the fact that I was just itching to jab my knife into his stomach every second of the day. There he was, right in front of me, that stinking copycat, talking and acting just like me even though he wasn't. Yet I couldn't do anything. Not until that evening. The time eventually came, and the two of us decided to walk back to my house. I told him of the supposed shortcut, and I led him to a relatively small park by the river that ran through the town. I had been thorough in my preparations. The previous night, I'd buried a weight and a rope in a thicket of trees nearby, so that I could eventually tie him up and throw him into the river after killing him. There were some rowboats tied to the docks a little ways away from the park, so I could simply steal one of those, row a little further up the river, and dump the body. Lastly, actually killing him wouldn't be a problem either. I'd received a little hand-to-hand combat training from my mom, so I knew the quickest and most effective ways to end a life. As the cool autumn breeze stung our faces, we walked up into the park. I expected Thomas to be surprised and presume we had gotten lost or something, but he did nothing. He just stopped at the riverbank and stared into the river. I always did like rivers, Thomas spoke out as I stood behind him. Slowly, cautiously, I withdrew my switchblade. You never know what's underneath that ever-flowing surface of theirs, he continued. What someone could have hidden. I wasn't going to wait any longer. I held the knife backhand and went for a stab, aiming for his jugular. I was surprised, however, when he ducked right on time, and it was only then that I noticed a shiny object in his hand, another knife. Thomas immediately tried to slash me, but I jumped back in time to avoid him. He stood up straight, his face somewhat obscured by shadow as the sun set behind him. Yet, I was sure I could make out a slight smile on his expression. I'm really hoping you were smart enough to come prepared for this, he said, taking a step forward as he got into an attacking position. I mean, I know you're not as intelligent as I am, but surely even a knockoff like you has watched enough movies to know how to plan a murder. In retrospect, I think I should have felt surprise, or at least fear that my plan had gone awry. However, the only emotion I could register was anger. My hatred flared as I listened to his words. You think I'm the knockoff here? I exclaimed, gripping my switchblade tighter and preparing for his attack. Sorry to break it to you, but you're the only faker, and I can't let you prance around thinking you're better than me any longer. Thomas scoffed. Of course, that's the only way you can justify your existence, isn't it? Accusing me of being the ripoff, thinking you're the improved original version. But you're wrong, he boasted. I am the original. I am me, and you're just a lowly, imperfect copy trying to be me. Maybe, if you were a complete clone, I could condone it. But the fact that a piece of trash like you, who is inferior in every way, is out there, that's something I can't allow. He stepped forward, taking a jab at me with his knife. I swiped it to the left with mine before taking the opening and sidestepping to the right, slashing once again at his throat. He tried to jump back, but my knife still managed to cut deep into his shoulder. Blood spat out onto my clothes, and Thomas roared as it continued to leak down his arm. Fuck! He exclaimed as he gripped his shoulder with his free hand. His smile had deteriorated into a look of disgust and anger as he eyed me. Meanwhile, I had gained some confidence. With his right shoulder damaged, it would be more painful to swing his knife. I had gained the advantage. You fucking trash, how dare you? Thomas growled. I gave a slight smile. Isn't it obvious? Because you're nothing but a second-rate imitation. I'm the real one here, I informed him. It stands to reason that a piece of shit like you wouldn't even be able to touch me. Yes, I could see it now. Why was I even angry in the first place? This pathetic copy with delusions of grandeur couldn't touch me, his better counterpart. "Yeah, keep talking. I've heard it all before," Thomas spat. "But surely even you see it. You're just worse than me in every way. Unlike you, I proved myself. I've gotten rid of trash like you before, and I'm not afraid to do it again." I scoffed. He was just talking nonsense now, probably trying in vain to convince himself that he was real. Deciding to go on the attack this time, I reached down and grabbed a handful of the rocks lying on the riverbank. I threw all of them at Thomas, and he instinctively used his arm to shield his eyes. That was when I lunged, aiming for his right arm in order to incapacitate him. I wasn't fast enough, and he was able to parry my slash before quickly grabbing my wrist with his free hand. Holding it in place, he lifted his knife up, but as it came down to strike my trapped arm, I grabbed his wrist just in time. With the two of us now locked this way, we began to push each other back and forth, struggling to hold our footing on the rocks beneath us. "You'll see," Thomas grunted as he pushed. "I am the original. I waited this long, so I could prove it again." He pushed against me, knocking me onto the ground. He was now on top of me and pushing his knife ever closer to my chest. But still, for some reason, I felt no fear. I had nothing to worry about from him. I knew it. Thomas, however, looked far more agitated than when we had begun this little duel. "Only the original survives," he said through bared teeth as he struggled against me. "I knew you'd delude yourself into thinking you could win. I wanted to see you fail. To see the look in your eyes when I kill you. And you see that I'm—" His final words were cut short as my blade pierced his chest and his eyes widened in utter shock. I guess this must be that look he was talking about. Indeed, it was quite an amusing sight, the look of a worthless imitator finally being put in his place. I liked it very much. Luckily, the hand he had been holding my knife back with was still covered in blood from his shoulder injury, which had caused it to slip and my knife to be the first one in. I could feel the strength leaving his body as I pushed him off of me and sat up. I looked over to his convulsing form on the ground, that expression never leaving his face as he slowly struggled to look at the knife that had pierced his heart. Taking it out would only make more of a bloody mess, so I left it where it was. I smirked triumphantly as I waited for the life to fade from his eyes. Blood sputtered from his mouth as he tried to speak, but failed. The last words he would ever hear were but the simple truth. "You never even stood a chance, you cheap knockoff." The rest of the procedure went smoothly. Under the cover of darkness, I brought the body over to the boat before retrieving my weight and rope from the thicket of trees. My jacket had been bloody during the fight, so I removed it and buried it in the hole. My face and hair were a little bloody as well, but that was easily taken care of with a quick rinse in the river water. With the knife also thrown into the water with the body, all that was left was the blood stain he'd left on the rocks, which was cleaned up quickly by the tide. Seeing the blood get washed away, it occurred to me that Thomas had probably gone there intentionally to make sure that when he killed me, he wouldn't have to bother cleaning up the blood himself. It seemed he had planned my murder by counting on me to plan his, which made me wonder how he knew. He said he'd proven himself before, but I had no idea what that meant at the time. I didn't wonder about it for very long either, as I was too caught up in my victory to care much. The last few days passed like the breeze. The police came to question me about the disappearance of Thomas a couple of days after he'd been reported missing, since I was the last person he'd been seen with. I just told them that the last time I saw him was when he and I went separate ways to get to our houses, and this answer seemed to satisfy them. They probably assumed he had run away or something, like most missing kids. It didn't really matter, because 2 days later, I was out of there and off to New York. Only then did I feel truly successful. Uncaught and untouched, I was now indisputably the one and only Travis Burke. That summer was probably one of the best of my life. With my identity now to myself, I felt far better than I ever had before, and it showed. I began attending a youth group at my new local church and made friends with the people there. It was surprisingly easy, far less awkward than it had been before. Of particular interest was one girl, Leslie, who would later even become my girlfriend after I worked up the nerve to ask her out. The people from the youth group quickly introduced me to their other friends, and it wasn't long before I was well acquainted with everyone in most of their social circles. Things were going better than they ever had before. The entire time, though, a lot of the people kept saying something odd. "I swear I've seen your face somewhere before," they would always tell me upon meeting me. It troubled me because I thought news of Thomas Blake's disappearance might have gotten widespread enough to reach the next state over. Of course, this wasn't the case. In hindsight, I probably should have known what the real cause was. And so, I stand here today. As I enter my new classroom today at the beginning of my senior year, my eyes scan the room full of students. I take in the faces of those I don't recognize, making a mental note to talk to them later. Then I look over the ones I do know from last summer, and my eyes rest on one particular young man who's looking back at me with a surprised expression. I glossed over him earlier, having recognized him all too well despite never having met him. He has slightly lighter brown, curly hair, a slightly larger, crooked nose, and even almond-shaped eyes, with a darker tint to the iris's chocolate brown. It isn't long before the rest of the class notices, and eyes begin to shift between the two of us as whispers are exchanged. I'm less surprised about this than I think I should be, really. Realizing what Thomas must have been talking about the day I killed him, I can't help but smile slightly. It doesn't matter what he said, though. Unlike him, I am the original, and I know it. I couldn't be killed by Thomas, and I certainly can't be beaten by this guy either. He's just another knockoff that I'll have to put in his place. The wind brushing up against my face was common, but it never felt subtle to me. Never felt as if it was there to cool or comfort, only there to remind me of where I was. In my bed laid me, and in me laid my mind, which was a sanctuary where I reviewed the past events of life. Most nights the same memories would flash across my mind, my temple. Occasionally, however, a past instance unbeknownst to me would arise in the inner confines of my brain. These instances were special. They proved to me that there was more than just the tangible memories. These memories weren't real, yet they were. They had to be, or else how did I have them? One night, the wind was prominent. It was grazing against my mind, urging it to think. And so, like most nights, I would try to have thoughts until sleep fell upon me. That night was different, though. It was different because I wanted to rest. I didn't want to be kept awake in the complex and constant firings of the synaptic nerves inside me. Nevertheless, I knew that my longing to sleep was futile, and so I succumbed to the scratchings against my skull. I tried to force a memory out from the caverns behind the millennia of compressed stone, but my castle only lowered the drawbridge when I was ready. I waited, waited, waited. It wasn't easy to just lie awaiting the miracle of mental satisfaction, but I had no other choice. Looking back on it now, I don't remember what thought came to my mind that night. I am not certain of its confines, nor am I concerned with it any longer. All that I am aware of is that something came to me that night. I am positive of this, because I know that I fell asleep. Something fell asleep, at least. Maybe it was inside me. The dark corners of my world within my mind grew. They formed an endless ambiguity, and they regressed the steadfast luminance of the candles in the hall. The hall. I didn't stay in my dreams long, though. No time for that. I opened my eyes, and there he laid, next to me. He was there with me, and he was silent. I was startled, to say the least. How could this entity have possibly found me in my sanctuary? His eyes were open, but no expression was apparent. Was he observing me? Was he as shocked as I was? My questions were answered sooner than I thought, for he opened his mouth and said, "Hello, Taylor. It is nice to finally meet you." The guttural bellowings of his voice frightened me, but I did not want him to know what was in my mind. This being said, I knew that he had only opened his mouth to address the thoughts circling inside me. I responded slowly because the gravity of the situation was still setting in. "I suppose it is nice to meet you as well, although I don't have the pleasure of knowing your name as you do mine." The ever so slight stutter was enough to blow my cover. This person laying next to me was keen. I knew he had caught my falter. "No need to be afraid. I am not here to hurt you. Promise. Only here to show you," he snidely remarked with confidence abundant. I could feel a sense of warmth come over me, and the wind had gone stagnant. I started to wonder why I hadn't gotten up, why I hadn't ran away from this situation. I realized there seemed to be no threat, and to be honest, I wanted to see what he would say next. I waited and finally decided to lay on my side to face him. Up until this point, we were both on our backs, underneath the covers, except our faces. When I turned, he did as well. I suppose he felt it was only logical, but I was not sure he understood how unique this memory was. He looked like me, almost identical, except his face was narrower and his jaw more pronounced. His hair was lighter, but it was hard to tell considering my eyes were still adjusting to the darkness. We were close together, so close that I could feel his breath. It was ice, and the coldness of his aroma reminded me of the wind. I got to thinking. "Listen, I know that my thoughts are open to you. I know that you sense my fear. I'm afraid of you, and I want you say "Stop it," he said. "I can't interpret your mind. I don't need to. If you want me to leave, I will. But I'll return tomorrow night and the next until you are ready for me." I felt ashamed for some reason after this utterance entered me. Guilt, as if I had let him down with my statement of emotion. We had barely spoken at all, and yet I felt like I owed him something. Questions were puncturing my machinations. Make them stop. I am begging you. "You can stay, but I need answers." The implication of my demand didn't fully make known its consequence until it was too late, but I felt as though I had to require something from him. He sighed loudly, and it sent shivers down my spine. The mixture of cold and warmth in the room was intriguing, to say the least. My body was reacting to opposite stimuli every moment. The mental tiring was straining, to say the least. I held my own for as long as I could. "I was afraid you might say that. I am not here to give you answers, only to bring you to them." He laid his hand on my shoulder, saying, "You have to trust me. Constricting you would be tightening the shackles on me." I gathered the strength to confront him more vehemently. "What is your name and how did you get here? What are you?" His hand retracted sharply as if by pain. "As of right now, you know as much about me as I do. I am learning, though. I am learning quickly, and every word exiting your mouth helps. As for how I got here, isn't that obvious? You, of course. How else? I don't know what I am. It really all depends on what you want me to be, I suppose. You ask me of things only yourself can say." The wind was still non-existent. I was capturing everything. My eyes were gathering as much of his face as they could handle. My ears picked up every creak in the room. I was making sure that this was a memory I would surely not forget. I looked over to the digital clock behind him, only to find that the time was reading blank. Was I still dreaming? Obviously. Relief fell over me, and I finally felt at ease. It was time to make this encounter more interesting now that I knew for certain I was not in danger. "I don't want to name you. Let's be friends, though. I think that would be nice." His expression went from blank to anger instantly. His hand projected outward to grasp my throat with speed and precision on an uncanny level. I felt myself gasping for air. My eyes went black. The wind rose to a roar from my window, and I lost my hold on reality. When I awoke in the morning, I was facing the other side of where I had been strangled in my dream. I was glad to know I had not forgotten the dream, for it was a common occurrence. "Don't make light of me anymore. This is not a joke." The words exuded from behind me like a ghost wrapping its deathly fingers around my ear. I cringed and held my breath. It seemed like hours I waited there. I finally convinced myself that I was just paranoid and slowly turned over. My eyes met his dead on, and my heart stopped. "Why are you here? Why am I still dreaming?" I asked him with pain in my throat. He only smiled and said, "I'm sorry. I was only trying to make you see the truth." I touched him on the face. It was real. I tried to push him softly. There was weight in him. He didn't seem to mind the experiments I was running on him. He finally gathered how hard this was for my mind to wrap around. "Stop. Can't you see that I am real?" He cackled with much delight. I closed my eyes for a split second to regain composure, but when I had opened them, he was nowhere to be found. I checked underneath my bed like the toddler does for the monster. I looked in my closet and in every corner around the house. It was to no avail. I walked down the long hall between my room and the shower and decided to relax with a long bathing. My mind was racing and my heart would not cease its pounding. I dried myself off and figured that I was finally over the hellish nightmare that plagued me. I looked in the mirror to see if I needed to shave, but then it hit me. Like a sledgehammer to my skull, I collapsed in pain from the sight. There were bruises around my neck. I could see him behind me in the reflection pointing, but not saying a word. I didn't even try to turn around. I knew he wouldn't be there. I walked into the kitchen to find that my mother was already there cooking breakfast. She didn't notice the bruises. She never noticed anything. "Mom, when are we going to the doctor? I have been having trouble sleeping for months now." She pretended like she didn't hear me, but I knew why. Ever since Father died, we never had enough monetary resources to sustain even basic needs, much less unnecessary luxuries. Co-payments for medical checkup fell into the latter category, but my brain sure didn't want to accept that. The fort wasn't holding up. I needed sustenance to concentrate. I needed to focus, to gather my thoughts together. Just as I was about to ask how long the food would take to get ready, the plate was gently placed in front of me. The scent of the plate entered my nose. Needless to say, it was not a subtle sense considering my hunger. I ate in haste and was completely satisfied. My opinion of Mother was rising considerably, but I still could not let go her lack of understanding. As I lounged back to try and clear my head, I noticed out of the corner of my eyes that he was standing in the dark laundry room behind the crack of its closed door. I tried to ignore him, but he was as true as a statue in his deliberate staring into my soul. I needed a distraction, but I was hoping for something a little less abrasive than my baby sister screaming from across the house. "Take care of her, would you, son?" I left without saying a word. I welcomed the change of scenery once it sunk in that he was not going to give me peace. I gave Lena her bottle and helped her drink as much as she could. As terrible as it sounds, part of me hated her. Father had left Mother with child before he went missing on a business trip and never returned. As a result, we had another mouth to feed, and needless to say, it caused a multitude of complications for us financially. I held a grudge even though I knew it was irrational. All the memories of the family together was flooding my mind. I couldn't take it anymore. The pain. Make it stop. I left the room only to remember I had forgotten to take the bottle with me to be refilled. I saw him staring over the crib, looking down on her. He was whispering something, but I couldn't make out what it was. "Stop talking to her. Leave her alone. I thought you were here for me only." I raced to meet him, and I looked at his mouth in disgust. His whispers vanished in realization of my presence. He looked sad, as if I had somehow done him wrong. "Why don't you like me? Why won't you take me seriously? I am not a monster. I am just the first domino. I have what will start a new age for you. I will bring you the truth. I will set you free." He looked different. His face was narrower, and his jaw was enlarged. His eyes were sunken in and punctuated by a not-so-subtle line of darkened flesh. His hair was shorter, and he seemed taller than I remembered. I responded quickly. "What are you talking about? I have no idea what you want from me, or what I'm supposed to do. Don't you see how this isn't normal?" His demeanor changed. His movements became more cryptic. He breathed differently, and his eyes were shifting wildly. His mouth didn't move, but I could hear the words clearly. "This is all I have ever known. Soon, you will know it to be true as well." My heart sank, and fear was rising to unforeseen heights in my body. My fortress was destroyed and desecrated. I lost all composure I had and fled from the room. I could hear him laughing hysterically in the background, but I refused to let his reality consume mine. My thoughts were racing as fast as my heart, and there was a chilling draft in the house I did not feel before. I returned to my mother to bring the news that Lena was no longer in agitation. She was pleased, but seemed clueless to the fact that I was catching my breath. I walked back to my room down the hall, the long hall which separated my room from the rest of the house. I sat down and began to search for something to focus on. I pulled out my pocket knife and studied its contours. The blade was shiny and well kept. I loved my knife even though I had never used it for anything. It was a gift from my father, but I don't remember why he thought I would want it. My father. He was always a quiet person, and he was not home for most of what I can remember of my life. His job required him to travel a lot, and I never forgave him for that. I wanted to keep him home. I didn't want him to leave. Memories of him were always painful for me to reminisce, because they never lasted long enough for me to gather any real emotions. My mind always hated him for that. I glanced back down at the blade and saw his eyes perfectly aligned in the metal. I quickly snapped the knife back into its handle and tried to forget what I just saw. I needed something to get my mind off of him. Anything to make it stop. Anything would be better than this. The rest of the day was as abysmal as the beginning. He would pop up occasionally to remind me of his existence. Every time that he entered the confines of my senses, I felt the hostility rise. His words became increasingly vague and prophetic. His appearance worsened and his skin was becoming paler for every encounter. I couldn't bear to look at him anymore. I didn't want him to know that he was winning. Psychologically, he was straining me. He wouldn't attack my body anymore. Maybe he had learned something from the physical assault that he did not want to relive. Whatever the reason, he seldom got close to me anymore. I never trusted him from the beginning, but as the seconds passed, I saw him increasingly as an adversary. My room became more of a prison of nightmares than an escape from reality. I knew eventually night would come, and he would be there, the darkness being his home. My fears once again became a reality. As I lay down in my bed, he was already there waiting for me. He seemed more real at night, as if the silence empowered his voice. The stars shine light, but they will never shed wisdom like I do. It isn't long now. You will see the truth. I will help you remember. I am your friend Taylor. Don't you see that? I bit my tongue. When the blood of ties is plastered and dried on the floor, you will come to know the fullness of my being. The wind was picking up again, and I couldn't stop my brain from turning. I refused to respond to him. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of my words for his nourishment. I didn't want him to continue, but my lack of conversing only coerced his message more. I am the carvings on the trees of this land. This plane of reality suits me well. I like it here. I like being out in the open, not stuck in that infinitesimally confounding torture chamber. His implications were full of spite now. I was not deceived by the hopes of him still being on my side. I knew that something was going to happen. I knew that my stronghold would be weakened if I did not act fast. The wind was violent now, and so was my temper. I couldn't bear it any longer. I had to fight back. Shut up. Shut your hideous mouth. Get yourself out of my bed. Leave me alone. I'm not here for you. I know the truth. I know what I need to know. I screamed at him, the condensation droplets from my spit landing on his demonized and white face. He laughed at me. I was giving him exactly what he wanted. I was fueling his power, giving him strength. I couldn't breathe with this realization. My throat was closing as if he was strangling me like the night before. Yet he wasn't touching me at all, only infuriating me with his uncontrollable laughter. I am going to sleep. Please stop talking and let me have some solace, I said to him after he finally calmed down. As you wish, but know this. For every moment you waste not accepting me, you only delude yourself further from the truth that I will force you to see. That's something I am willing to risk. Good night. A week passed, and he was no longer a he. He had turned into an it, a grotesque disfigurement of the original person. Its skin was whiter than white. Its eyes glowed in the dark, and they were surrounded by pits as dark and as fiery as hell. Its jaw housed sharpened teeth, and his nostrils had regressed into a serpentine-like arrangement. It was bald and almost twice my size in height. It no longer laid in my bed, but instead resorted to sitting at the foot of my resting place, towering over me when it spoke its deadly transcripts. I grew to hate it, and that fact that it never revealed anything about the situation or how to rid myself of it. It was breathtakingly macabre, almost to the point of terror inducement. I grew used to it, though. I had no other choice. Its voice was distorted, and it became deeper in reverb. It was as if two entities were speaking at the same time, accompanied with accents of growls and screeches. I cowered inside whenever it came close. I want to know the truth. If it will make you go away, it is worth it. Anything is worth ridding myself of you, I said with an inch of confidence. In time, it regurgitated with hatred insurmountable. I pulled the covers from under its weight to go over my eyes. I couldn't sleep any other way. I wished to myself that this would be nothing but a distant memory while laying motionless. The wind reduced its intensity to normal levels, and I inched the covers from over me to find that it had left my sight. It had been so long since I was the only one occupying my bed, and newfound determination filled my mind. I awoke to screaming. Excruciatingly horrid cries for help were echoing throughout the room, and I was in a state of frantic confusion as I hurried to gain my senses. I did not realize what was happening, and I searched for it in the shadows, but I saw nothing and no one. I ran down the hall. It seemed like a marathon to reach the rest of the house. The screaming stopped abruptly, and my mind prepared me as best it could. Blood. Blood was seeping from my mother's room, and it was seeping fast. I slammed myself into the door and opened it in complete hysteria to find her. She was strewn all across the floor. Her limbs were detached, and her innards painted the walls red. Her head was caved in by brutal force and was laying on the ground directly in front of me. I cried uncontrollably. Who could have done such a thing? I remembered that the screams were only present a few moments ago, and so I tried to contain my complete terror in order to assess the situation. The killer must still be in the house, here waiting for me. Before I could turn around to hide, I heard a faint crying. Lena, I thought, was surely next. As I hurried to her room as fast as humanly possible, I accepted the possibility that I would be too late. If there was anything I could do, I would do it. But I readied myself for futility and death. It was standing there, holding Lena from her right leg upside down. It pulled out my pocket knife and stabbed her relentlessly and mercilessly. I screamed. Is this the truth you were talking about? Leaving me alone with no family, with nothing and no one to care for? Answer me! Answer me! It dropped my sister's lifeless body onto the floor with no remorse, turned to me and calmly said, I only wanted you to finally be free of these bars that have been holding you back. Now you can begin to accept what you are. I felt like I was going to vomit. I could hardly maintain myself from fainting, but I knew I had to fight back. What kind of monster are you? I said, defeated and helpless. I am you. I always have been. I always will be. You cannot run from me. You cannot hide from me. You fool yourself into think you are afraid of me when you reject the truth that we are one and the same. It hissed and began walking closer to me. One step at a time, the wind rose higher and more intense. My brain throbbed in pain. What are you talking about? Why are you doing this to me? It laughed with a devilish grin and spoke to me in delight. This isn't the first time, you fool. You have had your hatred for another too, and I came out to save you from your torment. You didn't thank me, though. You pushed me back into your prison, and you tried your best to forget the memories. You were succeeding too, but there is a part of you who never wanted me to leave. I shuddered and slid to the ground with my back propped up against the door to keep me upright. I was remembering it all, the way I had wanted my sorrow to cease, the way I had wished for the strength to end everything, to destroy the reality that had obliterated my dreams. You wanted your father gone too, and I had no choice but to save you. You decided to live a lie after, and you discerned to torment me. I am not enacting my revenge. No, I could never harm you. Here I am trying to help you again, and you still treat me like a beast. I lunged from the ground and snatched the knife from his hand. I wielded it as if I had trained to fight for years and managed to keep it at bay. No! You can't hurt me, Taylor. It will never work. I will only come back stronger. You have to give in eventually. See the truth. I stabbed it in the heart. I pulled out and went in again, reaching as high as I could at the neck. I left the knife and watched it fall to the ground lifeless. I grabbed my heart and felt pain arise from beneath my skin. My neck was giving acute pain as well, but my mind was giving me the most trouble. I can never die. I will never be gone from you. You can't escape me. I remembered this story today and had to write it down to make sure the facts were straight in my head. Except I never had this memory. No, I did. I had to have had this memory, or else how am I remembering it? The wind feels nice today. It brushes up against my face often, but it never feels subtle to me. Help me. Make it stop. Please. I had always thought the stories about the old Victorian house at the end of Maple Street were just that, stories. But on that fateful night, when my parents left me alone for the weekend, I found myself caught in a nightmare I could never have imagined. It was the first time I was alone in our house. I was 16, and my parents trusted me to take care of myself while they attended a wedding out of town. I wasn't worried. I had the whole weekend planned out with video games, snacks, and late-night horror movies. Friday evening started off perfectly. I ordered pizza, played some games, and watched The Exorcist with the lights off, feeling a thrill of excitement with every jump scare. As midnight approached, I decided to head to bed. I brushed my teeth, turned off all the lights, and climbed under the covers, ready for a good night's sleep. That's when I heard the noise. It was faint at first, a soft creaking sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere deep within the house. I dismissed it as the old wood settling, or maybe a branch brushing against the window. But the noise continued, growing louder and more insistent. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the hallway just outside my bedroom. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained to listen, hoping to hear anything that would explain the noise away. But all I could hear was the rhythmic creak of the floorboards coming closer and closer. Gathering my courage, I slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the door. I pressed my ear against it, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but there was only silence. I let out a shaky breath and slowly opened the door. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through the windows. I crept down the hall, my bare feet making no sound on the cold wooden floor. I checked each room, expecting to find nothing, but each shadow seemed to move. Each corner hid a lurking figure in my mind. As I reached the living room, a A chill ran down my spine. The front door was wide open. I knew I had locked it before going to bed. I stepped outside, peering into the darkness, but there was no one there. I quickly shut the door and locked it again, double-checking this time. Just as I turned to head back to my room, the lights went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and I stood there, paralyzed by fear. My mind raced, trying to remember where I had left the flashlight. I fumbled my way to the kitchen, bumping into furniture and stubbing my toe against the coffee table. I finally found the flashlight and turned it on, the weak beam cutting through the darkness. I felt a little better with the light in my hand and decided to check the circuit breaker in the basement. I hated the basement. It was cold and damp, and the air always felt heavy with a musty smell that clung to my clothes. I opened the door to the basement and shone the flashlight down the stairs. The beam barely reached the bottom, casting long, sinister shadows on the walls. I took a deep breath and descended the steps, each creak of the old wood echoing in the confined space. As I reached the bottom, I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time they were above me. I looked up, the beam of the flashlight following my gaze, but there was nothing there. I found the circuit breaker and flipped the switches, hoping to restore the power, but nothing happened. Suddenly, the footsteps grew louder, faster, and more erratic, as if someone was running through the house. Panic surged through me, and I raced back up the stairs. When I reached the top, the footsteps stopped, and an eerie silence filled the air. I stood there, flashlight trembling in my hand, trying to steady my breathing. I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel a presence, something watching me, lurking in the shadows. I moved slowly, cautiously, back towards my room, every instinct telling me to get out of the house, but I was too terrified to leave. As I reached my bedroom, I saw it, a dark figure standing at the end of the hall. It was tall, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into my soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. The figure took a step forward, and I stumbled back into my room, slamming the door shut. I locked it and pressed my back against it, the flashlight beam shaking as I pointed it towards the door. The handle rattled, and the door shook as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. I backed away, my heart in my throat, and climbed onto my bed, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The door continued to rattle, the sound growing more and more violent. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited, not daring to move or make a sound. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, I gathered the courage to approach the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Slowly, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The hallway was empty. I stepped out, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and made my way to the living room. The front door was open again, swaying gently in the breeze. I didn't hesitate this time. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and ran out of the house. I didn't stop until I was at my neighbor's doorstep, pounding on the door, desperate for someone to let me in. They took me in, listened to my frantic explanation, and called the police. When the officers arrived, they searched the house but found no signs of an intruder. They chalked it up to my imagination, fueled by too many horror movies and the stress of being alone for the first time. But I knew what I had experienced was real. The footsteps, the open door, the dark figure. It wasn't just in my mind. The house at the end of Maple Street held secrets, dark and terrible, and I had come face to face with one of them. I never stayed alone in that house again. The memories of that night haunted me, a constant reminder of the shadows that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. Even now, years later, I can't walk down Maple Street without feeling a chill run down my spine. Some stories are more than just stories. Some nightmares are real. And sometimes, the darkness is not as empty as it seems.